Nobody said it out loud at first. That was the British way. You watched. You flew. You kept the observation to yourself until the debrief, and in the debrief, you chose your words with the precision of a surgeon working at the edge of a nerve. The senior RAF instructor sitting in the back of that briefing room at Naval Air Station Miramar in the early 1980s had been watching American fighter pilots train for 3 weeks. He had flown against them. He had read their manuals. He had sat in on their formal academic presentations, which were, by any measure, extraordinary, comprehensive, technically rigorous, delivered without notes in a culture of intellectual accountability that genuinely impressed him. These were serious men who took the science of aerial combat with a seriousness that matched his own. And yet, after 3 weeks, after dozens of engagements, after watching the most celebrated fighter weapons school on Earth produce its graduates and send them back to their fleet squadrons with the program's famous patch on their flight suits, the RAF officer wrote 5 words in his notebook that would become the core of what he said when they finally asked him for his assessment. Your pilot is too comfortable, not too slow, not underskilled, not poorly trained in the technical fundamentals of air combat maneuvering. Comfortable, the word landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. The ripple it produced would take years to fully understand. To understand why that word was devastating rather than complimentary, to understand why an American naval aviator who had just survived one of the most demanding training programs in the world should feel disturbed rather than reassured to be called comfortable. You have to go back. Not to Miramar. Not to the famous trailer where it all began. You have to go back further, to a catastrophe so complete and so humbling that it forced the entire United States Navy to sit in a room and admit that the most powerful air arm in human history had nearly forgotten how to fight. The year was 1968. The United States Navy's kill ratio against North Vietnamese fighters had collapsed to approximately 2.5 enemy aircraft destroyed for every American jet lost. In the Second World War, that number had been 14-1. In Korea, it had been 12-1. Those ratios weren't just statistics. They were the accumulated proof of American air superiority, the operational expression of everything the Navy believed about itself in the air. And now, over the jungles and river deltas of Southeast Asia, flying the most technically advanced aircraft in the world against a third world adversary operating second-hand Soviet designs, the Navy was barely staying above parity. The primary American fighter was the F-4 Phantom II. The F-4 was a monster of an aircraft, twin engines, supersonic capability, a top speed approaching Mach 2.2, and the ability to carry more ordnance than a Second World War heavy bomber. It had been designed as a long-range missile platform for intercepting Soviet bombers at high altitude. It was powerful beyond anything the North Vietnamese could field, and almost nothing else. The North Vietnamese were flying MiG-17s and MiG-21s. The MiG-17 was subsonic. It had been designed in the late 1940s. Its cockpit was cramped, its avionics were primitive, and its radar was essentially non-existent. Against an F-4 flown by a competent pilot employing modern tactical doctrine, it should have been no contest, but there was a problem. The F-4, in its original naval configuration, had no gun. The decision to remove the gun from the Phantom had been made at the highest levels of American defense planning based on a strategic assumption that defined the late 1950s. Nuclear weapons and long-range missiles had rendered close in dogfighting obsolete. The era of knife fights in the sky was over. The future of aerial combat was the beyond visual range missile engagement, the clean kill at 10 miles, the interceptor hitting its target before either pilot could see the other. The gun was dead weight. So they removed it. In Vietnam, the missiles didn't work. Not reliably, not consistently. The AIM-7 Sparrow, the Navy's primary radar-guided air-to-air missile, had a real-world kill rate of approximately 9.2% under combat conditions. The AIM-9 Sidewinder, the infrared heat-seeker that should have been the defining weapon of the age, achieved roughly 18%. These weren't design failures in the abstract engineering sense. They were operational failures produced by a specific combination of factors: salt air corrosion from carrier operations that degraded sensitive electronics, rules of engagement that required visual identification before firing and so negated the missile's long-range advantage, and the basic reality that in the compressed, chaotic geometry of a real dogfight, the engagement envelopes that missiles required rarely existed in the way training ranges had led pilots to expect. Without reliable missiles and without a gun, American Phantom crews found themselves in close quarters combat against agile subsonic aircraft that could turn inside their turning radius, bleed airspeed in tight defensive spirals, and force engagements into the one arena where American technology provided no advantage whatsoever. And there was another problem, perhaps more fundamental than any equipment failure. American pilots were not trained for this. In the late 1950s and through the early 1960s, with the nuclear doctrine ascendant and the dogfight officially declared extinct, air combat maneuvering, the traditional art of close-in fighter-versus-fighter engagement, had been quietly removed from training syllabuses across the Navy and Air Force. There was no formal requirement for fleet fighter pilots to practice dissimilar air combat training, meaning combat against aircraft of different types with different performance envelopes. Pilots trained against their own type in controlled scenarios on ranges where the geometry was familiar and the threat aircraft was an identical copy of their own machine. They became very good at flying their specific aircraft in the specific conditions their training produced. Against the conditions Vietnam actually delivered, this was nearly useless. On May 10, 1972, the numbers crystallized into a single day. In the largest air battle of the war's second phase, U.S. Navy pilots flew against North Vietnamese fighters and achieved a kill ratio that forced immediate institutional reckoning. The entire sequence produced something remarkable, not a tactical innovation in the air, but a document on the ground. In 1968, Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Thomas Moore had ordered Captain Frank Ault, a Second World War veteran with commanding officer experience, to conduct a comprehensive study of why Navy air-to-air performance had degraded so catastrophically. Ault's team worked for months, and their resulting report, known simply as the Ault Report, contained 242 specific recommendations covering everything from missile quality control to maintenance procedures to, most crucially, the fundamental philosophy of how Navy pilots were being trained. One observation at the heart of the report would alter the trajectory of American military aviation for the next half-century. It was not a criticism of courage. It was not a criticism of individual skill. It was a criticism of the training system itself. Navy pilots, the report concluded, were not being exposed to realistic air combat conditions. They were learning to fly well. They were not learning to fight. 2 months after the Ault Report was published, in a repurposed trailer at Naval Air Station Miramar in San Diego, California, a lieutenant commander named Dan Pedersen stood in front of the first class of what would become the most famous fighter weapons school in the world. There were 9 students. There were 9 instructors. There was very little funding and almost no institutional support from the Navy establishment, which still regarded the whole enterprise with some skepticism. The United States Navy Fighter Weapons School opened on March 3, 1969. It would eventually be known by the single word printed on 1,000 movie posters, squadron patches, and recruiting posters worldwide: Top Gun. Pedersen and his founding instructors understood something that the tactical doctrines of the previous decade had obscured. An F-4 Phantom was, under the right conditions, an extraordinarily capable fighter. It was fast. Its radar was powerful. Its missiles, when they worked, were lethal. But the conditions under which it could best express these capabilities were not the conditions a North Vietnamese MiG driver would willingly provide. The job of a good fighter pilot was not to fly his aircraft well in familiar conditions. It was to create the conditions in which his aircraft's advantages were decisive, and deny the enemy the conditions in which the enemy's advantages were decisive. This was a tactical and intellectual problem, not merely a physical one. The Top Gun curriculum was built around this insight. Instructors studied Soviet doctrine and tactics with the rigor of academics. They learned to fly like the threat to exploit the performance edges of smaller, more agile aircraft the way Soviet-trained pilots would exploit them. Then they flew against students in scenarios designed not to confirm the student's existing skill, but to expose its limits. The student wasn't there to win. The student was there to fail in a controlled environment, understand precisely why he had failed, and rebuild his approach from the intellectual ground up. Every lecture was given without notes, a requirement that demanded a depth of knowledge that went beyond memorization into genuine understanding. Every presentation was subjected to what the school called a murder board, a panel of instructors whose explicit function was to identify flaws, ambiguities, and logical weaknesses in a draft lecture, and force the presenter to resolve them before a class ever heard a word. The culture was one of relentless intellectual accountability that made it socially impossible to present an argument you couldn't fully defend. The results, when combat resumed in 1972, were staggering. Navy kill ratios against Vietnamese MiGs soared to over 20-1. Some adjustments bring the final verified figure to approximately 12.5-1, still an order of magnitude better than the 2.5-1 figure that had prompted the Alt report. The Air Force, which had not implemented comparable training reforms, saw no improvement in the same period. The conclusion was unambiguous. Training had done what technology alone had failed to do. By the late 1970s, Top Gun was an institution. By 1986, when a Hollywood film turned its name into a global brand, it had already transformed the entire approach to fighter combat training across the Western world. Pilots from allied nations attended. Exchange programs brought foreign instructors in. The curriculum evolved constantly, incorporating new aircraft, new weapons, new threat profiles, new lessons from real combat. The school demanded intellectual honesty above celebrity. Instructors didn't coast on reputation. They flew, they learned, they updated. What the Alt report had produced was not just a training program. It had produced a culture of self-critical excellence that became the model for advanced military aviation education globally. Which is precisely why what the RAF instructor said in that debrief stung so deeply. To understand the perspective that RAF officer brought into the room, you have to understand the parallel world of British fighter training, a world that shared Top Gun's foundational commitment to excellence, but arrived at it through a different institutional inheritance. A different set of pressures, and a different relationship between the training system and the operational reality it served. The Royal Air Force had been producing fighter pilots since 1916. Its institutional memory included the Battle of Britain, where outnumbered pilots had defeated the Luftwaffe through tactics developed in real time against a tactically sophisticated enemy. It included the Western Desert, where kill ratios had been built through improvisation, aggression, and a studied refusal to fight on the enemy's terms. It included Korea, where RAF exchange pilots had flown F-86 Sabres alongside American counterparts and accumulated individual combat records that stood alongside the best in any Air Force. It included the Malayan Emergency, Oman, the Falklands, a continuous thread of operational experience that, unlike the peacetime American Navy of the late 1950s, never allowed the institutional muscle memory of actual combat to fully atrophy. The British equivalent of Top Gun was the Qualified Weapons Instructor course, the QI. Where the American program ran for approximately 13 weeks, the British QI course ran for 5 months. This was not an accident of scheduling or resource allocation. It reflected a fundamentally different philosophy about what a weapons instructor needed to be. The Top Gun graduate was expected to return to his fleet squadron and raise the tactical standard of the unit through example, mentoring, and the dissemination of current best practice. He was the unit's tactical evangelist. The QI graduate was expected to do all of this and more. He was expected to be an original thinker, someone capable not just of transmitting existing doctrine, but of questioning it, testing it against emerging threats, and generating new tactical solutions that fed back into the system from the bottom up. The QI course began with 2 weeks of combined ground school, covering the weapons systems and tactical doctrines of multiple aircraft types, not just the student's own platform. This cross-domain understanding was considered foundational. A QI needed to know how the threat thought, how Allied aircraft thought, and how the interaction between different platforms in a complex multi-aircraft scenario created tactical opportunities and vulnerabilities that no single platform specialist could fully perceive. The course then ran for months of squadron-based training before culminating in the combined QI, a large-scale exercise where everything learned over the preceding months was tested against real opposing forces in realistic scenarios. The graduates wore a patch, as Top Gun graduates wore a patch. But within the RAF, the QI qualification carried a specific cultural weight that went beyond prestige. It was understood as a license to be institutionally difficult, to push back against received wisdom, to argue with wing commanders, to insist that a tactic demonstrated to be suboptimal be changed regardless of how long it had been in the syllabus. The QI was supposed to be a constructive irritant. The system needed irritants. Comfort in the RAF tactical culture was not a compliment. This was the specific background the RAF instructor carried when he walked into Miramar. And what he saw there over 3 weeks of observation and combat flying was something that a less analytically precise observer might have missed entirely. The Top Gun graduates he flew against were genuinely excellent. He was unambiguous about this. Their aircraft handling was fluid, their situational awareness was sharp, their radio discipline was professional. Their knowledge of the tactical scenarios they practiced was comprehensive and real. They knew the school's curriculum, the principles of offensive and defensive maneuvering, the geometry of missile employment, the diagnostic frameworks for identifying tactical problems in real time at a level that reflected serious commitment to learning rather than perfunctory attendance. But there was a pattern in the way they flew that only became visible across multiple engagements. Individual engagements revealed nothing unusual. Across a large enough sample, something emerged. When placed in a specific defensive situation, the Top Gun graduates tended to respond with the same maneuver, not because they were copying each other in the air, because the training environment had, through repetition and the natural human tendency to consolidate successful responses into habit, produced a standardized solution to a standardized problem. The maneuver was the right maneuver. It was correct by the curriculum. Against a threat aircraft performing as the curriculum expected the threat to perform, it worked. Against a threat aircraft performing differently, doing something unexpected, something outside the envelope of what the training scenarios had taught the graduate to prepare for the standardized response, created predictability. And predictability in air combat is a death sentence dressed in a correct syllabus. This is the thing the RAF instructor was pointing at when he wrote those 5 words in his notebook. Not incompetence, not laziness, not insufficient exposure to the academic content. The graduates were too comfortable because the training had given them reliable answers to familiar questions, and the reliability of those answers had created a subtle psychological dependency. They knew what worked. They flew what worked, against an enemy who had studied what worked, against an enemy who had designed his tactical approach specifically to present the situation in which what worked didn't work. The comfort became a liability. The specific criticism documented in accounts of exchange programs between British and American aviation communities during the Cold War period was framed in terms that the RAF instructor considered fundamental to his own training philosophy. It was the difference between learning responses and learning principles. A pilot who had learned the correct response to a given threat geometry could execute that response with precision and speed. A pilot who had learned the underlying principles from which that response derived could do something the response learner could not. He could improvise. He could recognize in the compressed microsecond of an engagement turning against him that the correct response didn't apply to this specific situation and generate a new response from first principles faster than the enemy could capitalize on the gap. The RAF officer put it in a debrief in terms his American colleagues found simultaneously irritating and clarifying. He said, "I know your maneuver before you fly it. I've watched you enough. I know which way you'll break." In a classroom, that's a compliment. In a cockpit over hostile territory, that's an obituary. The parallel that the British observer was drawing on, consciously or not, was the lesson that had produced Top Gun in the first place. American pilots in Vietnam had flown predictably. They had followed known flight paths. They had broken in known directions. They had applied textbook responses to tactical situations without the adaptability to recognize when the textbook response was what the enemy was waiting for. The North Vietnamese Air Force, coached partly by Soviet advisors who had studied American tactical doctrine in the same spirit of professional adversarialism that Top Gun itself embodied, had designed their engagement tactics around exactly this predictability. They baited. They waited. They attacked from the angle the American training had not prepared the American pilot to defend. Top Gun had been founded to destroy that predictability. The murder board existed for this reason, to prevent any idea from becoming so established that it stopped being examined. The adversary instructor training, implemented in 1975, existed for this reason, to ensure that the aircraft simulating the enemy threat actually flew like the enemy, which required genuine expertise in enemy doctrine rather than a superficial approximation. The culture of relentless debrief, where every engagement was dissected and every decision was examined, existed for this reason, because the moment a pilot stopped learning from his mistakes was the moment his enemies started benefiting from them. What the RAF instructor was observing in the early 1980s was Top Gun's success creating the precondition for Top Gun's failure. The school had been so effective at defining best practice, and the fleet had absorbed those practices so thoroughly, that a generation of graduates had internalized optimal responses as automatic responses without fully internalizing the critical thinking that was supposed to underpin them. The response was right. The thinking behind the response was fading into habit. And habit, in a high-performance cockpit against an adaptive adversary, was the beginning of the end. This was not a new observation in military aviation. The same pattern had appeared before and would appear again. The RAF itself was not immune to it. The specific value of the exchange program of a British instructor sitting in an American debrief, or an American pilot spending time with a RAF squadron in Cyprus or Germany, was that the outsider saw the pattern precisely because the outsider had not been trained to produce it. The discomfort of an honest external assessment was the discomfort of a man being told something true about himself by someone who had no reason to soften it. The Americans who heard the debrief had two choices. They could regard the RAF officer as presumptuous, a visitor commenting on an institution he had experienced for 3 weeks without the depth of understanding that came from living it for years. Or they could regard him as a precisely positioned external observer with a different training inheritance and a disinterested perspective, delivering exactly the kind of institutionally uncomfortable truth that the murder board had been designed to generate and that no insider, however honest, could reliably produce about the system he was embedded in. To their enormous credit, the Americans listened. Understanding why the RAF officer's critique landed as hard as it did requires a brief examination of what the British training system was producing that American training was not, and why the difference mattered specifically in the context of the Cold War threat environment of the late 1970s and early 1980s. The RAF Central Flying School, the oldest flying training institution in the world, tracing its origins to 1912, operated under a principle that the British call above average, meaning a categorization system for flying instructors that went beyond competence and toward mastery. The highest categories, A2 and A1, required not just excellent flying, but the ability to teach excellence to others, which in practice demanded a level of self-awareness about one's own performance that ordinary flight competence did not generate. A Khoi who had passed through the Central Flying School's instructor pipeline brought to every engagement a habit of self-analysis that the training system had spent years embedding as an automatic response. The RAF also trained its fighter pilots in a context that was geographically and tactically different from the American carrier-based environment, operating over Western Europe, potentially against Soviet aircraft combining high performance with aggressive doctrine. RAF pilots could not assume the engagement geometries that made standard responses optimal. Soviet tactical thinking, absorbed through intelligence analysis and exercises with Warsaw Pact adjacent scenarios, emphasized surprise, unusual approach angles, and exploitation of the psychological vulnerabilities that predictable training created. The RAF trained against this, specifically designing scenarios to present pilots with problems for which the standard curriculum had no answer, forcing them to reason from principles rather than reach for habit. This approach was visible in the way the 527th Tactical Fighter Training and Aggressor Squadron at RAF Alconbury operated. Formed in 1976, the 527th was a USAF unit American pilots flying Soviet-marked aircraft, wearing Warsaw Pact patches, drilling themselves in Soviet doctrine with an intensity that turned foreign tactical thinking into a kind of second nature. But they operated in Britain, in the European theater, alongside RAF units whose own training philosophy pressed on the 527th's approach from an interesting direction. The RAF didn't just observe what the Americans were doing with aggressor training. It contributed to the conversation. British exercise culture, which from the 1970s onward increasingly incorporated large-scale multi-type engagements under realistic electronic warfare conditions, pushed American exchange participants toward a more complex, less controllable environment than the measured progressions of the Top Gun curriculum. What the RAF instructor brought to Miramar was this experience, the product of training in a less controlled environment against a more varied threat picture, in a culture that regarded comfortable certainty about correct responses as the first step toward tactical death. The concept the British instructor was advancing had a name in the RAF lexicon, though it would take years for it to crystallize into the formal language that military training institutions use when they codify hard-won insight. It was the distinction between procedural mastery and adaptive mastery. Procedural mastery is what Top Gun built brilliantly in its graduates. A pilot with procedural mastery knows what to do. He can execute complex maneuvers under pressure, manage the cognitive load of an engagement while maintaining situational awareness, apply the correct tactical doctrine to the most likely scenarios with a speed and precision that is genuinely remarkable. Procedural mastery is necessary. Without it, you cannot survive the first engagement. It is the floor of competency that no amount of adaptive thinking can compensate for if it isn't there. Adaptive mastery is what the RAF instructor was saying was insufficient. It is the ability to recognize in real time when the correct procedure has become the wrong procedure, when the enemy has studied your procedures and designed an approach that turns your procedural mastery into a predictable pattern he can exploit. Adaptive mastery requires something that procedural mastery can actually erode: comfort with uncertainty. A pilot with strong procedural mastery and insufficient adaptive mastery is, in a very specific way, more vulnerable than a pilot with weaker procedural mastery who hasn't yet consolidated his responses into habit, because the first pilot's confidence in his procedures can prevent him from recognizing when his procedures are being used against him. The RAF training system built adaptive mastery through a deliberate cultivation of tactical discomfort. Exercises were designed not to confirm the correct answer, but to make the correct answer ambiguous. Scenarios were varied specifically to prevent the formation of reliable automatic responses. Debriefs didn't just ask what you did and whether it worked. They asked what you thought the enemy was doing while you were doing it, and whether you had any evidence for that assessment, and what you would have done differently if the enemy had been doing something else. The debrief was designed to make the pilot aware of his own assumptions, because assumptions in combat were the enemy of adaptability. This was the culture that produced the Quai who sat in the back of the briefing room at Miramar. He wasn't watching the Top Gun graduates with contempt. He was watching them with the specific unease of a man who recognized a pattern he had been trained to regard as dangerous in pilots who were genuinely excellent and who deserved an honest assessment of where their excellence might, under specific conditions, become of vulnerability. What happened after that debrief is in some ways the most important part of the story, because the response of the American institution to an uncomfortable external assessment tells you more about the health of a military training culture than the critique itself. Top Gun, by the mid-1980s, had already begun wrestling with the specific challenge the RAF instructor had articulated, though from a different angle. The school had recognized that its curriculum, built around the study of specific threat aircraft and specific Soviet tactical doctrine, was producing graduates who were excellent against the threat the curriculum described. Against an adversary who deviated significantly from Soviet doctrine, or against a future threat that Soviet doctrine couldn't anticipate, the specific technical knowledge the curriculum transmitted might fail to generalize. The answer Top Gun developed was not to abandon procedural training. The foundation remained. What evolved was the way the curriculum embedded critical thinking about the procedures themselves. The murder board, which had always existed as a check on intellectual complacency among instructors, was reinforced as a model for how students should approach their own tactical thinking. The debrief culture intensified. The expectation that a Top Gun graduate could explain not just what he did, but why he did it, and what he would have done differently if the enemy had responded differently, became a more explicit component of the evaluation. The exchange program that had placed the RAF instructor at Miramar in the first place was expanded. Allied pilots brought perspectives that no internally generated assessment could replicate. They flew differently. They had trained differently. They had different institutional blind spots and different institutional strengths, and the collision of those differences, handled well in the debrief room, produced insights that homogeneous institutions couldn't generate. By the 1990s, exchange program graduates from the RAF, the Royal Australian Air Force, and the Canadian Air Force had left fingerprints on the Top Gun curriculum that the American founders would not have predicted. This was the real legacy of that debrief. Not a confrontation between British skepticism and American excellence, but a demonstration of something both systems, at their best, already understood. The standard you accept in training is the standard you die by in combat. An institution that cannot hear uncomfortable assessments of its own methodology from credible external sources has replaced learning with reputation management, and reputation management has never shot down a MiG. The question the RAF instructor's observation raises is larger than the specific moment that produced it. It is a question that every training institution that achieves genuine excellence eventually has to confront. At what point does mastery become rigidity? At what point does the consolidation of best practice begin to crowd out the creative discomfort that produced the best practice in the first place? At what point does comfort, genuine, earned, evidence-based comfort in what you know how to do, start quietly doing the enemy's work for him? The Vietnam-era answer to this question was Top Gun. The Top Gun-era answer to this question was the culture of self-examination that the school had to reinforce to prevent its own success from becoming the precondition for future failure. And the answer to the question in each subsequent generation has been the same thing it has always been. You keep the uncomfortable observer in the room. You give him access to your training. You ask him what he sees. And when he tells you something that makes the room go quiet, you resist the very human instinct to defend the institution that produced you. And you listen. The RAF instructor who wrote those 5 words in his notebook understood something that the founding instructors of Top Gun had understood in 1969, and that every generation of military aviators has had to rediscover in each era. The most dangerous thing in a fighter pilot's cockpit is not the enemy's missile. It is the moment when the pilot stops expecting to be surprised. Your pilot is too comfortable. 5 words. 3 weeks of watching the best trained naval aviators in the world fly with the settled confidence of men who knew exactly what to do. And from those 5 words, delivered in a room that went quiet, an institution whose entire reason for existence was to produce uncomfortable truths about how pilots fight, had to sit with the most uncomfortable truth about itself. that the training system it had, built brilliant, rigorous, continuously evolving, genuinely the model for the world, had in its very success produced the one thing it had been designed to destroy: a comfortable pilot in an uncomfortable world. The A-4 Skyhawks that the early Top Gun instructors flew as aggressor aircraft against their own students were eventually replaced by F-5E Tiger IIs and later by F-16s. The trailer at Miramar became a complex of buildings at Fallen, Nevada. The 9 instructors and 9 students of the first class became a cadre of some of the most technically accomplished aviation educators in military history. The curriculum expanded from a narrow focus on air-to-air combat into a comprehensive school for modern strike warfare. The kill ratios, when American naval aviation was tested again, reflected everything the school had built. But in the background of all of that achievement, there was always the question that had been asked from the back of a briefing room by a man whose own training system had given him the specific disposition to ask it. Not from hostility, not from the desire to diminish something he respected, from the professional obligation to say true things about what he saw, which was the only reason either institution existed. The best combat training systems in the world share one thing. They are built by people who understand that excellence is not a destination you arrive at and then defend. It is a question you ask yourself every time you strap in. Am I flying what I know, or am I flying what this enemy is about to do to me? That question, asked before the first engine lights, is what separates the comfortable pilot from the dangerous one. And the RAF instructor who walked into Miramar, watched for 3 weeks, flew against the best, and said 5 words that nobody wanted to hear, he was not the enemy of what Top Gun had built. He was exactly what Top Gun had been built to produce. A man who could see what everyone else had stopped seeing, and who was uncomfortable enough to say so. That is the real story of what the RAF instructor left behind at Miramar. Not a rivalry, not a national comparison, an act of professional honesty from someone trained to regard silence in the face of something worth saying as the more dangerous failure. The 5 words found their mark because the institution that received them had been built, from its very first trailer in 1969, by men who already understood exactly what they meant.